All right, welcome back, people, to the next session for reading Marx and Engels on the Dictatorship of the Proletariat. We are continuing and hopefully finishing the first draft to the Civil War in France. We recently got through a very substantial part wherein Marx describes the particulars of the commune itself. So the takeaway is as follows. One, after the revolution, the industrial bourgeoisie will have to leave behind all the means of production, as is fixed capital, or, land and factories and so on and so forth. It's fixed to the ground, in other words. In modern days, it's a little more complicated given digital assets, but still. They attempt to go on proverbial strike, refusing to invest and to manage. In a false revolution, this would engender a crisis, but under a true workers' revolution, a commission is appointed which organizes and cooperates with delegates to different trades and to take over these deserted fixed capitals and put them under the control of the cooperative workmen societies. 2. The various functionaries need to keep the state functioning in a judicial and executive terms, including judges and elected officials and bailiffs and the like, becomes agent of the commune and have fixed salaries like all other workmen. So in other words, they aren't paid out the nose. And they become, rather than political beings, they become like any other worker. Three tribunals are under general suffrage. 4, the weapons of the terror of the old order are torn down, their symbols removed, and their political prisoners released. Next, in the spirit of internationalism, a national background of one workman or another ceases having meaning. In other words, foreign nationals can be elected to position. In the commune, there's an abolition of political and professional oaths. I criticize this, but it doesn't seem particularly important. Then there ceases supreme control over any individual or organ, with authority changing hands according to whatever is of import at any given time on the basis of authority and capability, interest, and knowledge. The police bureaucratic apparatus is abolished. Secular education is implemented. A central committee is elected and emerges out of the organized militias as a military organ, with backgrounds of workmen and soldiers representing and being members of the masses. Quote, to the objection of the outsiders that they are unknown, in point of fact, that they were only known to the working classes, but no old stagers, no men illustrious by the infamies of their past, by their chase after pelf and place. They proudly answered, quote, so were the 12 apostles, and they answered by their deeds. Next, it was the complete negation of the ruling state. One, brought the people power over its own social life. 2, broke down the machinery of class domination itself. And 3, integrated executive and parliamentary forms of class domination into one. So no division of power or whatever in terms of legislative, executive, judiciary, and so on and so forth. Next, it reabsorbed the state power by society as living forces. It did not reduce the power, it wielded it as the power of the popular masses and turned that power from oppression to emancipation. It ended the standing guard army, which defends the government against the citizens, and established militias, which defend the citizens against the government. This also, by the way, better defends against foreign aggression and ceases the costly upkeep of a standing army, because if the whole of the population is armed and capable of fighting and is trained, then that means that anybody trying to actually invade a nation of prepared people is not going to have an easy time. Complete suffrage is reestablished. Positions of power cease having jargon and red tape, and positions are filled with recallable civil servants that act under continuous supervision and are paid as much as the next workman. These positions 1. Are no longer divided between government, police, and prefecture. 2. Do their work publicly and simply under broad daylight. 3. Recognize fallibility and admit blunders and correct them, criticism and self-criticism. And 4. Are sapped by workmen, not by mystifying functionaries. Then, with the establishment of communes across the nation, suppression by surprise or sudden reaction becomes impossible. And ultimately, the state functions are reduced to a few functions for general national purposes. One understand asks, wouldn't it be very hard to train everyone as well as most standing armies are trained? Yes, but at the same time, you are not specifically aiming to, invade anybody. You are aiming for self-defense. That means that you don't really need any of that. I mean, you're going to need some people with, like, planes and shit. So there's not really a circumstance where you can get away with not having any professional full-time people involved in military duties. But it will be a fundamentally different sort of army, in the same way that armies under feudalism were significantly distinct from armies under capitalism. But that's something to talk about and look into. One of the main issues is that having a standing army is incredibly expensive. It requires large amounts of upkeep, and it is entirely what would be termed as non-productive. It is luxury goods, ultimately. It would be in Department 2, I believe. Luxury consumption. It doesn't expand the means of production, and it's not consumed by workers in order to maintain and expand their existence. It's a sink, more or less. However, it is also a sink that ends up being required in a world wherein, imperials exist. We want to reduce that as much as possible, but with the understanding that imperials do exist for the time being, and we will have to respond to them. But anyway, we have gone through our previous section. Now we will continue on with the text. Section on peasantry. War indemnity. Even before the installment of the Commune, the Central Committee had declared through its journal official, quote, the greater part of the war indemnity should be paid by the authors of the war, end quote. And footnote. In these words, Marx summed up the gist of an article which elucidated the stand of the Central Committee on the National Guard on the payment of the war indemnity. The article appeared in the Journal Officiel de la République Française. Back to the text. This is the great, quote, conspiracy against civilization the men of order are most afraid of. This is the most practical question. With the Commune victorious, the authors of the war will have to pay its indemnity. With Versailles victorious, the producing masses who've already paid in blood, ruin, and contribution will again have to pay, and the financial dignitaries will even contrive to make a profit out of the transaction. The liquidation of the war costs is to be decided by the Civil War. The Commune represents on this vital point not only the interests of the working class, the paid middle class. In fact, all the middle classes with the exception of the bourgeoisie, the wealthy capitalists, the rich landowners, and their state parasites. To note, at the time, the nobility were still around, right, in some form or another. Either directly or indirectly, the aristocratic class was still in existence. The bourgeoisie at the time were the middle class. That is, they were the emerging class that owned large means of production which could not be operated by any individual worker, and so they would hire labor in a particular relation that would work for them, and then they would expand that. Over time, with these various bourgeois revolutions, which this actually in many ways consisted of, at this time the bourgeoisie were revolutionary. They destroyed or converted the aristocracy into bourgeois forces themselves. There are no aristocrats still around. There are still some semi-feudal relations existing, but pretty much everything has been converted into only the bourgeoisie and only the proletariat. Again, there exists some semi-feudal relations. There's some semi-peasantry, for example, in India. And you could make an argument that in the rural locations of China, for example, there are peasantry. There are many that engage in subsistence farming. And they are being proletarianized. I don't have any strong numbers on that, though. Back to the text. It represents above all the interests of the French peasantry. On them, the greater part of the war taxes will be shifted if Thiers and his Roureaux are victorious. And people are silly enough to repeat the cry of the Roureaux that they, the great landed proprietors, quote, represent the peasant, who is, of course, in the naivety of his soul, exceedingly anxious to pay for these good landowners the milliard of the war indemnity, who made him already pay the milliard of indemnity, the revolution indemnity. Footnote. On April 27, 1825, the reactionary government of Charles X promulgated a law compensating former immigrants for the loss of their estates and other confiscated in the years of the bourgeois French Revolution. In other words, the nobility that fled the French Revolution and came back later. The greater part of the indemnity, totaling 1,000 million francs and paid by the government in the form of 3% securities, was obtained by the chief aristocrats at court and the big landlords of France. Back to the text. In other words, these people are getting paid out the nose over and over again. 1 second. Excuse me. The same men deliberately compromised the Republic of February by adding the additional 45 centimes tax. Footnote, the Provisional Government of France decided on March 16, 1848 to add a 14 centimes tax to each franc of direct tax collected. The burden of this additional tax fell mainly on the peasants. As a result of this policy adopted by the bourgeois Republicans, the peasants were estranged from the revolution and voted for Louis Bonaparte, that would be the third, by the way, in the presidential election of December 10th, 1848. And Louis Bonaparte III, basically think of him as Donald Trump. That's what we have determined. Back to the text. The same men deliberately compromised the Republic of February by the additional 45 centimes tax on the peasant, but this they did in the name of the revolution, in the name of the provisional government created by it. It is now in their own name that they waged a civil war against a communal republic to shift the war indemnity from their own shoulders upon those of the peasant. He will, of course, be delighted by it. The Commune will abolish conscription. The party of order will fasten the blood tax on the peasant. The party of order will fasten upon him the tax collector for the payment of a parasitical and costly state machinery. The Commune will give him a cheap government. The party of order will continue to grind him down by the townist usurer. The Commune will free him of the incubus of the mortgages resting upon his plot of land. The Commune will replace the parasitical judiciary body eating the heart of his income, the notary, the huissier, etc., by communal agents doing their work at workmen's salaries instead of enriching himself out of the peasant's work. It will break down this whole judiciary cobweb which entangles the French peasant and gives abode to the judiciary bench and mires of the bourgeois spiders that suck its blood. The party of order will keep him under the rule of the gendarme. The commune will restore him to independent social and political life. The commune will enlighten him by the rule of the schoolmaster. The party of order force upon the stultification by the rule of the priest. But the French peasant is above all a man of reckoning. He will find it exceedingly reasonable that the payment of the clergy will no longer be extracted from him by the tax collector, but will be left to the, quote, spontaneous action of his religious instinct. Copy that in. A reminder that we are doing these sessions here to learn what Marx and Engels have to say about the character of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Continuing. The French peasant had elected Louis Bonaparte president of the Republic, but the party of order, during the anonymous regime of the Republic under the Assembly, Constitution, and Legislative, was the creator of the empire. What the French peasant really wants, he commits to show in 1849 and 52 by opposing his mayor to the government's prefect, his schoolmaster to the government's parson, himself to the government's gendarme. The nucleus of the reactionary laws of the Party of Order in 1849, and peculiarly in January and February 1850, footnote, were specifically directed against the French peasantry. And the footnote reads, this refers to laws that divide France into military districts and gave commanders extensive powers, granted the President of the Republic the right to appoint and remove burgomasters, placed schoolmasters under the control of the prefects, and extended the clergy's influence over national education. Marx gave a characterization of these laws in his work, The Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850. And we had read that before. Back to the text. If the French peasant had made Louis Bonaparte president of the Republic because in his tradition all the benefits he had derived from the First Revolution were fantastically transferred on to First Napoleon, the armed uprisings of the peasants in some departments of France and the gendarme hunting upon them after the coup d'etat proved that delusions was rapidly breaking down. The empire was founded on the delusions artificially nourished into power and on traditional prejudices. The commune would be found on his living interests and real wants. Just a little bit. It's not particularly important, but it's any notation. Continuing. The hatred of the French peasant is centering on the rurals, the men on the chateau, the men on the milliard of indemnity, and the townish capitalist masquerading as a landed proprietor whose encroachment upon him marched never more rapidly than under the Second Empire, partly fostered by artificial state means, partly naturally growing out of the very modern development of modern agriculture. The rurals know that 3 months' rule of the Republican Empire in France would be the signal of the rising peasantry and the agricultural proletariat against them. Hence their ferocious hatred of the commune. What they fear even more than the emancipation of the townish proletariat is the emancipation of the peasants. The peasants would soon acclaim the townish proletariat as their own leaders and seniors. There exists, of course, in France, as in most continental countries, a deep antagonism between townish and rural producers, between the industrial proletariat and the peasantry. The aspirations of the proletariat, the material basis of its movement, is labor organized on a grand scale, although now despotically organized, and the means of production centralized, although now centralized in the hands of the monopolist, not only as a means of production, but as a means of the exploitation and enslavement of the producers. What the proletariat has to do is to inform the present capitalist character of that organized labor and these centralized means of labor, to transform them from the means of class rule and class exploitation into forms of free associated labor and social means of production. On the other hand, the labor of the peasant is insulated and the means of production are parceled, dispersed. Basically, the peasant, one of the primary distinctions for them is they actually owned land, right? The peasants owned their own land. that they lived upon. They had certain rights and stuff like that. But with the development of modern agriculture, uh, the only way the peasantry could not compete. Subsistence farming with some small petty production and manufacturing cannot maintain the peasant's existence in the face of developing agricultural production, industrial agricultural production. But industrial agricultural production also requires absolutely massive swathes of land. In other words, the peasants had their land continually bought up by the big bourgeoisie and the landowners. And so, through various tactics, both it's secretive and through taxation and so on and so forth, through the enclosure of the commons, the peasantry found themselves having to pay larger and larger amounts of money for smaller and smaller amounts of land and having less and less of a material basis to maintain their own existence as a class. Eventually, they were weakened enough that they were forced off of their historical lands and into proletarian relations. They're forced into cities. They lost all ownership of any capital, any land, or anything along those lines, besides their own labor. That's the only thing that they owned, that they could sell as a commodity. And then they would go out and they would find capitalists to sell their labor to in the form of abstract labor power. The average amount, to reproduce the proletariat as a class across the entirety of a society. So, right here, I'm going to simply take this back to the text. On these economical differences rests superconstructed as a and footnote as superstructure. Okay, yeah, is a whole world of different social and political views. But this peasantry proprietorship has long since outgrown its normal phase, that is, the phase in which it was a reality, a mode of production and a form of property which responded to the economical wants of society and placed the rural producers themselves into normal conditions of life. It has entered its period of decay. On the one side, a large rural proletariat has grown out of it, whose interests are identical with those of the townish wage laborers. The mode of production itself has been superannuated by the modern progress of agronomy, agricultural economy. Lastly, the peasant proprietorship itself has become nominal, leaving to the peasant the delusion of proprietorship and expropriating him for the fruits of his own labor. The competition of the great farm producers, the blood tax, the state tax, the usury of the town mortgagee, and the multitudinous pilfering of the judiciary system thrown upon him, around him, had degraded him to the position of a Hindu ryot. I have got to know what. Oh, I see. A Hindu, an Indian peasant cultivator. Gotcha. Okay. While expropriation, even expropriation from his normal proprietorship and his degradation into a rural proletarian, is an everyday fact. What separates the peasant from the proletarian is, therefore, no longer his real interest, but his delusive prejudice. If the commune, as we have shown, is the only power that can give him immediate great loans even in its present economical conditions, it is the only form of government that can secure to him the transformations of his present economic conditions, rescue him from expropriation by the landlord on the one hand, save him from the grinding, trudging, and misery on the pretext of proprietorship on the other, that can convert his nominal proprietorship of the land into real proprietorship of the fruits of his labor, that can combine for him the profits of modern agronomy dictated by social wants and every day now encroaching upon him as a hostile agency, without annihilating his position as a really independent producer. Being immediately benefited by the communal republic, he would soon confide in it. And I'll take that as well. Okay. Next session. Union Republicain, the party of disorder, whose regime toppled, reached its summit. I see. Never mind. The party of disorder, whose regime reached its summit under the corruption of the Second Empire, has left Paris. Exodus from Paris, followed by its appurtenances, its retainers, its menials, its state parasites, its mouchards, its coquettes, and a whole band of low common criminals that formed the complement of the boheme of quality. But the true vital elements of the French middle classes, delivered by the workmen's revolution from their sham representatives, has for the first time in the history of the French revolutions separated from it and come out in its true colors. Is the Ligue of the Republican liberty, acting the intermediary between Paris and the provinces, disavowing Versailles and marching under the banners of the Commune. We have a footnote. This probably refers to the Alliance Republican des Departments. Note 81, excuse me. This was a political organization of the pay bourgeois elements who came from the different provinces and lived in Paris. It called on the provinces to support the Commune and fight against the Versailles government and the monarchist National Assembly. Back to the text. The communal revolution as a representative of all classes of society not living upon foreign labor. Footnote, the labor of others. Yes. We have, which in this case would actually include the pay bourgeois, by the way. We have seen that the Paris proletarian fights for the French peasant, and Versailles fights against him. That the greatest anxiety of the Roureaux is that Paris be heard by the peasant and no longer separated from him through the blockade. To those who were not here for the previous sessions, Marx talks, the first session in particular, Marx talks about the propaganda war that was going on, wherein no information about the commune was really being shared externally. He was getting letters from people, but nobody could actually publish anything in any papers or journals that would reach the peasantry. That at the bottom of its war upon Paris is the attempt to keep the peasantry as its bondmen and treat him as before as its maitre. Quote, its object liable to pay taxes at its mercy and behest. End quote. For the first time in history, the petty and moyenne middle class, the pay and mill bourgeoisie, has openly rallied around the workmen's revolution and proclaimed it as the only means of their own salvation and that of France. It forms with them the bulk of the National Guard. It sits with them in the Commune. It mediates for them in the Union Republicaine. The principal measures taken by the Commune are taken for the salvation of the middle class, the debtor class of Paris against the creditor class. That middle class had rallied in the June insurrection, 1848, against the proletariat under the banners of the capitalist class, their generals, and their state parasites. It was punished at once on the 19th of September, 1848, by a rejection of the Concordance Amicable. We already know what that is, but for those who don't, here's a footnote. This refers to rejection of the bill on the Concordance Amicable by the Constituent Assembly on August 22nd, 1848. The bill provided for the deferment of the payment of debts by any debtor who could prove he had become bankrupt, owing to stagnation of business caused by the revolution. As a result of this, a considerable number of the pay bourgeoisie became totally ruined and were left to the tender mercy of the big bourgeois creditors. Back to the text. The victory over the June insurrection showed itself at once as the victory of the creditor, the wealthy capitalist over the debtor, the middle class, insisted mercilessly on its pound of flesh. On the 13th of June, 1849, the National Guard of that middle class was disarmed and sabred down by the army of the bourgeoisie. During the Empire, and as a result of the dilapidation of the state resources, upon which the wealthy capitalists fed, this middle class is delivered to the plunder of the stock jobber, the railway kings, the swindling associations of the credit mobiler, etc., and expropriated by capitalist association, joint stock company. If lowered in its political position, attacked in its economical interests, it was morally revolted by the orgies of that regime. The infamies of the war gave the last shock and roused its feelings as Frenchmen. Considering the disasters bestowed upon French by that war, its crisis of national breakdown and its financial ruin, this middle class feels that not the corrupt class of the would-be slaveholders of France, but only the manly aspirations and the Herculean power of the working class can come to the rescue. They feel that only the working class can emancipate them from priest rule, convert science from an instrument of class rule into a popular force, convert the men of science themselves from the panders of class prejudice, place-hunting state parasites, and allies of capital into free agents of thought. Science can only play its genuine part in the Republic of Labor. As we all know, science has a class character under a class relation. Only things that are profitable get studied outside of public institutions, and only things that are profitable out of those public institutions get adopted. It has nothing to do with the actual use of it, and the mass majority of people are barred from any sort of scientific development as well, because they lack the time and money for it. Like art, it is in service to the ruling class by and large, especially for anything of large scale, in requiring a large scale. Okay, continuing. Republic only possible as avowedly social republic. This civil war has destroyed the last illusions of the republic, as the empire destroyed the delusions of unorganized universal suffrage in the hands of the state gendarme and the parson. All vital elements of France acknowledge that a republic is only in France and Europe possible as a social republic. As a republic which disowns the capital and landlord class of the state machinery to supersede it by the commune, that frankly avows social emancipation as the great goal of the republic and guarantees thus that social transformation by the communal organization. The other republic can be nothing but the anonymous terrorism of all the monarchical factions, of the combined Legitimists, Orleanists, and Bonapartists to land in an empire of any kind as its final goal. The anonymous terror of class rule, which having done its dirty work, will always burst into an empire. In other words, this is quite obvious, but any state, any bourgeois state, which of course, integrates the bourgeoisie and bourgeois interests in it, automatically is going to not be democratic, because you've got the interests of this class that is expropriating all the other classes and has great amounts of moneyed power and so on and so forth, and dominates the state, and then they emerge into a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, which is there in order to suppress the class interests of all others. And then this dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, of course, will eventually emerge into an empire, because the capitalist class is one of accumulation. It expands, it seeks to enter into new markets, to take more resources more cheaply, have access to more labor. Therefore, any quote-unquote quote-unquote republic of the bourgeoisie is necessarily going to turn into a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie and then turn into an empire. Therefore, the only way that you can have any form of actual democracy would be a communal government, one that does not allow the bourgeoisie or the landowners or any of these interests within it. That is a dictatorship of the proletariat, of the working class. This seems pretty obvious to me, but many people seem to struggle with this. I don't know why. Continuing. The professional Republicans of the Rural Assembly are men who really believe, despite the experiments of 1848 to 51, despite the Civil War against Paris, the Republican form of class despotism to be a possible lasting form, while the Party of Order demands it only as a form of conspiracy for fighting the Republic and reintroducing its only adequate form, monarchy or rather imperialism, as the form of class despotism. In 1848, these voluntary dupes were pushed into foreground till, by the insurrection of June, they had paved the way for the anonymous rule of all factions of the would-be slaveholders in France. So this is why, parliamentary democracies are so useful for bourgeois states. You've got all these different, class interests within the bourgeois class. They're all united by their shared class interests of exploiting labor, private property ownership, etc., etc. But different capitalists have different interests, and by and large, they don't want to come into direct conflict with one another. They would rather have an organized, equal playing field to some degree in order to mediate out whether or not they should have tariffs or not, right? Some capitalists prefer heavy tariffs, other capitalists don't. The working class, of course, has very distinct interests to all these, but they are not listened to. They don't participate within bourgeois dictatorships in any meaningful sense. So you don't actually have a word in any of that. And that you can find very directly. But by having this, it makes it so, they're able to peacefully do that. And at the same time, rather than having a dictator that is very obvious or a monarch that's very obvious that the people can point to and blame for their woes, rather than the system itself, that makes it so it's very difficult to think about in American politics. Biden comes into position and he does literally all the exact same thing Trump's doing, in any sense of the word. Maybe he's got some social policies that are slightly distinct, but people eat that up. And then Trump comes in, and it's this back and forth, hot potato, and the anonymity of the class power is essentially, it's an ecstasy. It's what would be termed as a spectacle, society of the spectacle. It's not real. The material conditions aren't changing. The state remains exactly the same. I went through comparing the Democrats versus the Republicans in office and the wars that were started versus left. The Republicans literally start less wars than the Democrats, but are somehow seen as less war hawkish. I don't know why. But it's basically equal, and the only reason why it's less is because right after the Cold War, there was a little bit of a, slowdown there. The Democrats also do more CIA shit. That was another thing. They do more things that are involved with interrupting the democratic process in other foreign nations, or the Republicans are better at hiding it. Who knows? I don't really think that's the case. These organizations exist outside the state. It's the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Anyway, back to the text. In 1848, these voluntary dupes were pushed to the foreground till, by the insurrection of June, they paved the way for the anonymous rule of all fractions of the would-be slaveholders in France. In 1871 at Versailles, they are from the beginning pushed in the background, there to figure as the Republican declaration of Thiers' rule and the sanction by their presence the war of the Bonapartist generals upon Paris. In unconscious self-irony, these wretches hold their party meetings in the tennis court. That's a bit of history. That's where that's where the constitutional monarchy was declared, or whatever. Uh, that's not really correct, but it's where the middle class is essentially fought against the absolute monarchy, and it's considered one of the starting points for the French Revolution. To show how they have degenerated from their predecessors in 1789. Footnote. Oh, hello. This explains it better. The French Estates General on June 17th, 1789 took the title of National Assembly. In opposition to Louis XVI order that the three estates were to sit separately, the representatives of the Third Estate assembled at the tennis court in Versailles on June 20th and took an oath not to disperse until a constitution for France was worked out. The tennis court oath was one of the events that heralded the bourgeois French Revolution. Back to text. By their shoulders, etc., they tried to coax Paris into tendering its arms to Thiers, and to force it into disarmament by a National Guard of order, until Sy said, "We do not speak of the so-called socialist Paris deputies like Louis Blanc. They undergo meekly the insults of a Defer and a Roureau, dote upon their Thiers' legal rights, and whining in the presence of the banditti cover themselves with infamy." Okay. Workmen and Comte. If the workmen have outgrown the time of socialist sectarianism, it ought not be forgotten that they have never been in the leading strings of Comteism. This sect has never afforded the International, but a branch of about half a dozen of men, whose program was rejected by the General Council. Footnote. This refers to the Paris Society of Proletarian Positivists, whose program smacked of Auguste Comte's bourgeois philosophy. Though the General Council sharply criticized the program, it accepted the society as a section of the International in the early 1870 because of its working class composition. Back to the text. Comte is known to the Parisian workmen as a prophet in the politics of imperialism, personal dictatorship, of capitalist rule and political economy, of hierarchy in all spheres of human action, even in the sphere of science, as the author of a new catechism with a new pope and new saints in the place of old ones. And his followers in England play a more popular part than those in France. It is not by preaching their sectarian doctrines, but by their personal valor and by the acceptance of the forms of working men class struggle created without them, as F.I. Into German translate into sentence read, and because their sects accept the forms of proletarian class struggle which are created without them. So the trade unions and strikes in England, which they, by the by, are denounced as heresy by their Paris pro-religionists. I see. So in England, they accept things like strikes and trade unions, but in France, they denounce them. Okay. The Commune, social measures. That the workmen of Paris have taken the initiative of the present revolution and in heroic self-sacrifice bear the brunt of this battle is nothing new. It is a striking fact that all French revolutions is only a repetition of the past. That the revolution is made in the name and confessedly for the popular masses, that is, the producing masses, is a feature this revolution has in common with all its predecessors. The new feature is that the people, after the first rise, have not disarmed themselves and surrendered their power into the hands of the Republican mountebanks of the ruling class. That, by the constitution of the Commune, they have taken the actual management of the revolution into their own hands and found at the same time, in the case of success, the means to hold it in the hands of the people itself. Displacing the state machinery, the government machinery of the ruling classes by a governmental machinery of their own. This is their ineffable crime. Workmen infringing upon the governmental privilege of the upper 10,000 and proclaiming their will to break the economical basis of that class despotism which for its own sake wielded the organized state force of society. This is it that has thrown the respectable classes of Europe, as in the United States, into the paroxysm of convulsions and accounts for their shrieks of abomination, that is, blasphemy, and for their fierce appeals to assassination of the people and the Billingsgate of abuse and calumny from their parliamentary tribunes and their journalistic servants' hall. In other words, in the previous bourgeois revolutions, the peasantry, the proletariat, and the bourgeoisie, they collaborated together against the aristocracy. And they defeated the aristocracy and established a new class power, that of the bourgeoisie. And then after that, but during the bourgeois revolutions, of course, they said, oh, it's for the good of the people, it's in the name of freedom, liberty, equality, fraternity, and all that sort of stuff. But then what happens? Well, the bourgeois come into power, they take their position, they start the reign of terror, they destroy the working class, and they create new conditions of exploitation. The people rebel again. The petty bourgeois join them alongside the proletariat and the peasantry, this time against the now combined big bourgeoisie and the aristocracy. The big bourgeoisie having, in the face of this, resurrected and brought back the aristocracy, because the aristocracy would act as a counterbalance against the peasantry. Well, then what happens? Well, the proletariat are like, okay, no, we aren't going to bend to your class rule. We didn't bend to the aristocratic class rule. Why are we going to bend to the bourgeois class rule, which is even more directly in contradiction with us? And as a result, after having cheered for these revolutions for the bourgeoisie, now the bourgeoisie are in terror of this proletarian movement. And they denounce it and they call for all sorts of crimes, which of course are carried out. I cannot tell you the tens of millions of communists who have died to the most brutal forms of fascistic counter-revolution. The Jakarta Method is a brutal book, but I recommend reading it. Back to the text. The greatest measure of the commune is its own existence, working, acting under the circumstances of unheard difficulty. The red flag, hoisted by the Paris Commune, crowns in reality only the government of workmen for Paris. They have clearly, consciously, proclaimed the emancipation of labor and the transformation of society as their goal. But the actual social character of their republic consists only in this, that workmen govern the Paris Commune. And to their measures, they must, by the nature of things, be principally confined to the military defense of Paris and its provision and supply. Okay. Back to the text. Some patronizing friends of the working class, while hardly dissembling their disgust even at the few measures they considered socialist, although there's nothing socialist in them except their tendency, express their satisfaction, and tried to coax genteel sympathies for the Paris Commune by the great discovery that, after all, workmen are rational men, and whenever in power always resolutely turn their back upon socialist enterprises. They do, in fact, neither try to establish in Paris a phalansteer nor an Icarie. Footnote. Phalansteer, this is a name given by Charles Fourier, the French utopian socialist, to describe the cooperative settlement in an ideal socialist society. Icarie, an imaginary communist land described by an exponent of utopian communism, Etienne Cabet, in his social philosophical novel Voyage in Carrier. Back to the text. Wise men of their generation, these benevolent patronizers, profoundly ignorant of the real aspirations and the real movement of the working class, forget one thing. All the socialist founders of sects belonged to a period in which the working class themselves were neither sufficiently trained and organized by the march of capitalist society itself to enter as historical agents upon the world stage, nor were the material conditions of their emancipation sufficiently matured in the world itself. Their misery existed, but the conditions of their own movement did not yet exist. The utopian founders of sects, while in their criticism of present society, clearly describing the goal of the social movement, the supersession of the wages system, with all its economical conditions of class rule, found neither in society nor the material conditions of its transformation, nor in the working class the organized power and the consciousness of the movement. They try to compensate for the historical conditions of the movement by fantastic pictures and plans of a new society in whose propaganda they saw the true means of salvation. From the moment the working men class movement became real, the fantastic utopias evanesced, not because the working class had given up the end aimed at by these utopists, but because they had found a real means to realize them. But in their place came a real insight into historic conditions of the movement and more gathering force of the military organization of the working class. But the last two ends of the movement proclaimed by utopians are the last ends proclaimed by the Paris Revolution and the International. Only the means are different, and the real conditions of the movement are no longer clouded in utopian fables. These patronizing friends of the proletariat, glossing over the loudly proclaimed socialist tendencies of this revolution, are therefore but the dupes of their own ignorance. It is not the fault of the Paris proletariat. If for them the utopian creations of the prophets of the working men movement are still the social revolution, that is to say, if the social revolution is for them so utopian. In other words, the utopians are looking at their future thing and saying, why isn't it like that? And it's like, yeah, the working class is militarizing and it's an ugly affair. Wow. Really unexpected that a revolution would be an ugly affair and wouldn't come to fruition immediately. Continuing. Journal official of the Central Committee, 20th of March. The proletarians of the capital, in the midst of failures and the treasons of the ruling classes, have understood that the hour has arrived for them to save the situation in taking into their own hands the management of public affairs, the state business. End quote. They denounce, quote, the political incapacity and the moral decrepitude of the bourgeoisie as the source of the misfortunes of France, end quote. Quote, the workmen, who produce everything and enjoy nothing, who suffer from misery in the midst of their accumulated products, the fruit of their work and their sweat, shall they never be allowed to work for their emancipation? The proletariat, in the face of the permanent menace against its rights, of the absolute negation of all its legitimate aspirations, of the ruin of the country and all its hopes, has understood that it was the imperious duty and the absolute right to take into its hands its own destinies and assure their triumph in seizing the state power. This is a good quote. Oopsies. There. And we've got a footnote here. This is the Journal Official de la République Française. Back to the text. It is here plainly stated that the government of the working class is, in the first instance, necessary to save France from the ruins and the corruption impending upon it by the ruling classes. That the dislodgement of these classes from power, of these classes who have lost the capacity of ruling France, is a necessity of national safety. But it is no less clearly stated that the government by the working class can only save France and do the national business by working for its own emancipation. Conditions of emancipation being at the same time the conditions of the regeneration of France. It is proclaimed as a war of labor upon the monopolists of the means of labor, upon capital. The chauvinism of the bourgeoisie is only vanity, giving a national cloak to all their pretensions. It is a means by the permanent armies to perpetuate international struggles, to subjugate each country to producers by pitching them against their brothers in each other country, a means to prevent the international cooperation of the working classes, the first condition of their emancipation. The true character of that chauvinism, long since become a mere phrase, has come out during the war of defense after Sedan, everywhere paralyzed by the chauvinist bourgeoisie in the capitulation of France. The civil war carried on under that high priest of chauvinism, Thiers, on Bismarck's sufferance. It came out in the pay police intrigue of the anti-German League, in the foreigners hunting in Paris after the capitulation. It was hoped that the Paris people and the French people could be stultified into passion of their national hatred by facetious outrages to the foreigner forget its real aspirations and its home betrayers. And there's a footnote. During the period of the Paris Commune, the reactionary Paris Journal published a libellous report saying the Paris sections of the International had expelled all the German members from the International in accordance with the wish of the anti-German League. This is not the case, very obviously. How has this facetious movement disappeared, vanished, before the breath of revolutionary Paris, loudly proclaiming its international tendencies? Because the cause of the producer is everywhere the same, and its enemies everywhere the same, whatever its nationality. In whatever national garb, it proclaimed it as a principle the admission of foreigners into the commune. It chose even a foreign workman, a member of the International, into its executive. It decreed the destruction of the symbol of French chauvinism, the Vendôme calm. And while their bourgeois chauvins have dismembered France and act under the dictatorship of the foreign invasion, reminder that they were supporting, these traitors were supporting, Bismarck coming in and taking over because it would allow them to crush the Paris Commune. The Paris workmen have beaten the foreign enemy by striking at their own class rulers, have abolished fractions, and conquering the post as the vanguard of the workmen of all nations. The genuine patriotism of the bourgeoisie, so natural for the real proprietors on the different national estates, has faded into a mere sham consequent upon the cosmopolitan character imprinted upon their financial, commercial, and industrial enterprise. Under similar circumstances, it would explode in all countries as it did in France. So, right here, we are going to put that. Okay, back to text. Decentralization by the Rouleau and the Commune. It has been said that Paris, and with it the other French towns, were oppressed by the rule of the peasants, and that its present struggle is for its emancipation from a rule of the peasantry. Never was a more foolish lie uttered. Paris, as a central seat and the stronghold of the centralized government machinery, subjected the peasantry to the rule of the gendarme, the tax collector, the prefect, and the priest, and the rural magnates, that is, to the despotism of its enemies and deprived it of all life. It repressed all organs of independent life in the rural districts. On the other hand, the government, the rural magnate, the gendarme, and the priest, to whose hands the whole influence of the provinces was thus thrown by the centralized state machinery centering at Paris, brought this influence to bear for the government and the classes whose government it was, not against the Paris of government, the parasite, the capitalist, the idle, the cosmopolitan stew, but against the Paris of the workman and the thinker. In this way, the government centralization with Paris as its base, the peasants were suppressed by the Paris of the government, and the capitalist, and the Paris of the workmen was suppressed by the provincial power handed over in the hands of the enemies of the peasants. The Versailles Moniteur. Footnote. It refers to Moniteur des Communes, a French government newspaper published in Versailles during a period of the Paris Commune. Appeared as an evening supplement to the Journal Officiel of the Tiers government. Back to the text. Declares that, quote, Paris cannot be a free city because it is a capital. This is the true thing. Paris, the capital of the ruling classes, and their government cannot be a free city, and the provinces cannot be free because Paris is the capital. The provinces can only be free with the commune at Paris. The party of order is still more infuriated against Paris because it had proclaimed its own emancipation from them and their government. Because by doing so, it has sounded the alarm signal for the emancipation of the peasants and the provinces from their sway. 1 second, sorry. Back to the text. Journal Officiel de la Commune, 1st April. Quote, the revolution of the 18th March had not for its only object the securing in Paris the communal representation elected, but for the despotic tutelage of a national power strongly centralized. It is to conquer and secure independence for all the communes of France. And also for all superior groups, departments, and provinces united amongst themselves for their common interests by a really national pact. It is a guarantee and perpetuate the Republic. Paris has renounced her apparent omnipotence, which is identical with their forfeiture. She has not renounced that moral power, that intellectual influence, which has so often made her victorious in France and Europe in her propaganda. Footnote. This is from an editorial in the aforementioned journal. Then a second quote, this time again, Paris works and suffers for all France, of which it prepares by its combats and sacrifices the intellectual, moral, administrative, and economical regeneration, the glory and the prosperity. This is program of the Commune de Paris sent out by a balloon. Interesting. And footnote, from the proclamation to the people of France issued by the Paris Commune on April 19, 1871, and published in the Journal Officiel de la République Française. Back to the text. M. Thiers, in his tour through the provinces, managed the elections and, above all, his own manifold elections. But there was one difficulty. The Bonapartist provincials had for the moment become impossible. Besides, he did not want them, nor did they want him. Many of the old Orleanist stagers had merged into the Bonapartist lot. It was, therefore, necessary to appeal to rusticated legitimist landowners who had kept quite aloof from politics and were just the men to be duped. They have given the apparent character to the Versailles Assembly, its character of the chamber introuvable of Louis XVIII, its rural character. In their vanity, they believed, of course, that their time had at last come with the downfall of the Second Bonapartist Empire, and under the shelter of foreign invasions, as it had come in 1814 and 15. Still, they are mere dupes. So far as they act, they can only act as elements of the party of order, and its anonymous terrorism as seen in 1848 to 51. Their own party effusions lend only the comical character to that association. They are, therefore, forced to suffer as presidents the jail accoucheur of the Duchess of Berry and their ministers, the pseudo-republicans of the government of defense. They will be pushed aside as soon as they have done their service. But, a trick of history, by this curious combination of circumstances, they are forced to attack Paris because of revolting against the Republic une et indivisible. Oh, the Republic one and indivisible. Louis Blanc expresses it so, Thiers calls it unity of France. While their very first exploit was to revolt against unity by declaring for the decapitation and decentralization of Paris, by wanting the assembly to throne in a provincial town, what they really want to do to go back to is what preceded the centralized state machinery, become more or less independent of its prefects and ministers, and put into its place a provincial and local dominial influence of the chateau. They want a reactionary decentralization of France. What Paris wants is to supplant the centralization which has done its service against feudality, but has become the mere unity of an artificial body resting on gendarmes, red and black armies, repressing the life of real society, lasting as an incubus upon it, giving Paris an quote, apparent omnipotence by enclosing it and leaving the provinces outdoor. Footnote that outdoor means outside, of course. To supplant this unitarian France which exists beside the French society by a political union of French society itself through a communal organization. The true partisans of breaking up the unity of France are therefore the rurals, opposed to the united state machinery so far as it interferes with their own local importance, seigneurial rights, so far as it is the antagonism of feudalism. What Paris is wants is to break up that facetious unitarian system, so far as is the antagonist of the real living union of France, and a mere means of class rule. Okay. We're going to take this. In other words, seems quite obvious to me, but for anybody who is struggling to understand, essentially, or think about it like this. It's your homeowners association, if you happen to have it or be aware of them. Is it less like dictatorial than your state government? No. In fact, in many ways, it's far more directly controlling. Decentralization doesn't mean less control. In fact, it means a more complex interweaves of control. If you have proper centralization, and that's key there, proper centralization, then it's liberatory. Not more controlling. If you have improper centralization, or proper, of course, is a class characteristic, then it is far more oppressive. These guys, they want to establish decentralization in the same way libertarians do, and they claim, oh yes, it will lead to lots of liberty and stuff like that. And it's like, no, bro. You just want to become little dictators of your own little thing, and then nobody's able to organize to do anything about you. These guys, the Paris Commune, want to centralize in particular ways and decentralize in other ways, in ways that increase liberty and increase capacity of the state to organize and structure and so on and so forth, but not in a way that requires immense armies or anything like that to maintain that organization. In other words, free association is the goal. They want everybody to, of their own desire and will, freely associate without force. Back to the text. Comtist view. Men completely ignorant of the existing economical system are, of course, still less able to comprehend the workman's negation to that system. They can, of course, not comprehend that the social transformation of the working class aim is a necessary, historical, unavoidable birth of the present system itself. Footnote, Leo Frankel. He's making fun. They talk in deprecatory tones of the threatened abolition of property, because in their eyes, their present class form of property, the transitory historical form, is property itself, and the abolition of that form would therefore be the abolition of property. As they now defend the charity of capital rule and the wages system, They had lived in feudal times or in times of slavery, they would have defended the feudal system and the slave system as founded on the nature of things, as a spontaneous outgrowth springing from nature, human nature. They would have fiercely declaimed against their abuses, but at the same time, from the heights of their ignorance, answering to prophecies of their abolition by the dogma of their charity, weighed by moral constraints. They are as right in their appreciation of the aims of the Paris working classes as is Mr. Bismarck in declaring that what the commune wants is the social property which makes property the attribute of labor. Far from creating individual moral constraints, it will emancipate the morals of the individual from its class constraints. Poor men! They did not know that every social form of property has morals of its own, and that the form of, and it trails off, this would be, in the German translation, the last two paragraphs read, they are as right in their appreciation of the aims of the Paris working class as is M. Bismarck in declaring that what the commune wants is the Prussian municipal system. Poor men! They do not even know that every social form of property has morals of its own, and that the forms of social property which make property the attribute of labor, far from creating individual moral constraints, will emancipate the morals of the individual from its class restraints. So I'm going to put that in there. That's useful. How the breadth of the popular revolution has changed Paris. The Revolution of February was called the Revolution of Moral Contempt. It was proclaimed by the cries of the people, down with the big thieves, down with the assassins. Such was the sentiment of the people. But as to the bourgeoisie, they wanted broader sway for the corruption. They got under Louis Napoleon the Little's reign. Paris, the gigantic town, the town of historic initiative, was transformed into the gilded house, the brothel, of all the idlers and swindlers of the world, into a cosmopolitan stew. Cosmopolitan, in this case, does not mean in the sense of, in multi-ethnic and whatnot. In this sense, what is specifically referring to is essentially a form of cultural domination of one culture over others. And one second, let me just pull up what I have written from Ibn Sultan, Cosmopolitan. Apologies. Right, here we go. Liberalism tries to create false conditions of cosmopolitan identity through hegemonic control over unrecognized nations within their countries, destroying their communities, languages, territory claims, economic structures, and cultures in order to institute ones that are subservient to capital's preferences. No more obvious is this in settler colonial states which suppress the nationalities of those within and drive the attempted creation of such the outskirts and work to co-opt what they can. In other words, this is not, a uniting of different ethnic and cultural groups or anything like that. No, it is the taking of all these things, destroying them, recreating them under conditions wherein they are in service to the bourgeois state, and those that are not are repressed until they do so. So Marx is not against multi-ethnicity and multinationalism or anything like that. He's all for internationalism. He's all for all that sort of stuff. Okay, continuing. After the exodus of the better class of people, quote unquote, the Paris of the working class reappeared, heroic, self-sacrificing, enthusiastic in the sentiment of its Herculean task. No cadavers in the morgue, no insecurity in the streets. Paris was never more quiet within. Instead of the coquettes, the heroic women of Paris, manly, stern, fighting, thinking, working pairs, magnanimous pairs, in view of the cannibalism of their enemies, making their prisoners only dangerless. Footnote. In the German translation, this sentence reads, faced with the cannibalism of its enemies, it took measures so that the captives would not endanger any longer. Back to the text. What Paris will no longer stand is yet the existence of the coquettes and codes, so dandies. I think that these are the rich men and women. In the nobility? What it is resolved to drive away or transform is this useless, skeptical, and egotistical race which has taken possession of the gigantic town to use it as their own. No celebrity of the empire shall have the right to say, Paris is very pleasant in the best quarters, but there are too many paupers in the others. This was written in Le Vérité, a daily published in Paris by radical bourgeois Republicans from October 1870 to September 3rd, 1871. First it supported the Paris Commune, but later turned against the social measures the Commune had adopted. Quote, private crime wonderfully diminished in Paris. The absence of thieves and coquettes, of assassinations and street attackers. All the conservatives have fled to Versailles. Second quote. There has not been signalized one single nocturnal attack, even in the most distant and less frequented quarters since the citizens do their police business themselves. So, yeah, basically, crime, unsurprisingly, goes down when the people are happy. Whoa. Who knew? Continuing. Fragments. I see. These are fragments of statements. We'll go through these really fast. Tiers on the rurals. This party knows only to employ three means: foreign invasion, civil war, and anarchy. Such a government will never be that of France. Government of defense. And this same Trochu said in his famous program, quote, the governor of Paris will never capitulate. And Jules Favre in his circular, quote, not a stone of our fortress, nor a foot of our territories. Sans the quote, I shall never return to Paris save dead or victorious. He found afterwards at Bordeaux that his life was necessary for keeping down the, quote, rebels of Paris. These wretches know that in their flight to Versailles, they have left behind proof of their crimes, and to destroy these proofs, they would not recoil from making Paris a mountain of ruins bathed in a sea of blood. Manifeste à la Province by Balloon. Footnote, Le Revengueur. And we have a quote, the unity which has been imposed upon us to the present by the empire, the monarchy, and the parliamentary government is nothing but centralization, despotic, unintelligent, arbitrary, and onerous. The political unity as desired by Paris is a voluntary association of all the local initiative, a central delegation from the federal communes. End of the old government and clerical world of military supremacy and bureaucracy and jobbing and monopolies and privileges to which the proletariat owed its slavery and the country its misfortunes and disasters. Proclamation of the Commune, 19 April. This was Charles Montesquieu. From the Proclamation to the People of France, issued by the Paris Commune on April 19th, 1871. Okay. Actually, let me take this. Gendarmes and policemen. 20,000 gendarmes drawn to Versailles from all France. Im Ganzen 30,000 unter den Empire. Whatever the frick that means. Totally 30,000 under the Empire. And 12,000 Paris police agents. Basis of the finest army France ever had. That's a reference to something I think Montaigne said. I'm not sure. Republican duties of Paris. The Republican deputies, of Paris quote, have not protested either against the bombardment of Paris or the summary executions of the prisoners or the calumnies against the people of Paris. They have, on the contrary, by their presence at the assembly and their mutism, given a consecration to all these acts supported by the notoriety the Republican Party has given these men, have become the allies and the conscious accomplices of the monarchical party, declares them traitors to their mandate and the Republic. This is Association Générale des Défenseurs de la République, 9th May. It was a bourgeois democratic organization formed in Paris in February 1871 to fight for a republic. The association supported the Commune and criticized the policies of the Versailles government. The resolution of the association quote here appeared at the journal Officiel de la République Française. So yeah, reminder that in revolutionary times, silence is synonymous with support for the ruling power, and fence sitters are not appreciated. This should be obvious, but it seems to be a struggle for some people. Standing aside as Nazis, kill people is, essentially kind of supporting the Nazis. Not gonna lie. Okay. Quote, centralization leads to apoplexy in Paris and to absence of life everywhere else. Lemonis. Quote, today everything relates to a center, and the center is, to so to speak, the state itself. That's Montesquieu. This guy is a famous liberal writer. Or philosopher. Vendôme affair. However you pronounce this O with the little thing above it. The Central Committee of the National Guard, constituted by the nomination of a delegate of each company on the entrance of Prussians into Paris, transported to Montmartre, Belleville, et La Villette, the cannon and the mitrailleuses founded by the subscription of the National Guards themselves, which cannon and mitrailleuses were abandoned by the government and national defense, even in those quarters which were to be occupied by the Prussians. So, reminder for the people who weren't here, essentially the government of defense, they actively collaborated with the Prussians and Bismarck in order to sell France, not as a whole, but areas of it, and most specifically the Paris Commune, which was essentially selling France, over to Prussia, because they recognized that, hey, the Paris Commune is taking over and these are our class enemies. If we collaborate with Bismarck, yeah, we will be a captive people, but at the same time, we keep our class character. We simply become compradors and we get all this. And the only thing that they asked for in return for giving up was literally for Bismarck to come in with 40,000 people and crush the Paris Commune. So their request to, take over France, their capitulation, the only thing that they got in return for their capitulation was more invasion of France. These people were, in every sense of the word, even the bourgeois sense, traitors. But essentially the national government of national defense, when it surrendered, left behind its weapons and munitions because they had promised them to Bismarck. The people of Paris, however, said, fuck that, we are not surrendering to these guys. They're going to come in and kill us all. They took up arms. They organized spontaneously with elected generals and stuff like that, and organized a defense and succeeded. They pushed back the Prussians. Back to the text. On the morning of the 18th March, the government made the energetic appeal to the National Guard. But out of 400,000 National Guards, only 300 men answered to surrender. On the 18th March, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the agents of police and some battalions on the line were at Montmartre, Belleville, and La Villette to surprise the guardians of artillery and to take it away by force. The National Guard resisted. The soldiers of the line raised their butts of their guns in the air, despite the menaces and the orders of General Lecomte, shot the same day by his soldiers at the same time as Lieutenant Thomas. Troops on the line threw the butts of their muskets in the air and fraternized with the insurgents. In other words, the National Guard, which is originally there to oppress the commune, realized the reality of the situation and allied with them. And then they killed their traitors generals. The Bulletin of Victory by Aurel de Paladins was already printed. Also, papers found on the decentralization of Paris. Footnote. Decemberization, which means coup d'etat to be staged in the way as Louis Bonaparte did on December 2nd, 1851. Okay. On the 19th of March, the Central Committee declared the state of siege of Paris erased. On the 20th, Picard proclaimed it for the Department of the Seine et Oise. 18th March, morning, so believed in his victory. Proclamation of tears placarded on the walls. Quote, the government has resolved to act. The criminals who affect to institute a government must be delivered to regular justice, and the cannon taken away must be restored to the arsenals. End quote. Later in the afternoon, the nocturnal surprise having failed, he appealed to the National Guards. Quote, the government is not preparing a coup d'etat. The government of the Republic has not and cannot have any other aim than the safety of the Republic. End quote. He will only, quote, do away with the insurgent committee, almost all unknown to the population, end quote. Late in the evening, a third proclamation to the National Guard, signed by Picard and Aurel, quote, some misguided men resist formally the National Guard and the army. The government has chosen that your arms should be left to you. Seize them with resolution and to establish a reign of law and save the Republic from anarchy. End quote. On the 17th, Scholer tries to wheedle them into disarming. Proclamations of the Central Committee to the 19th March. Quote, the state of siege is raised. The people of Paris is convoked for its communal elections. ID to the National Guards. Quote, you have charged us to organize the defense of Paris and of your rights. At this moment, our mandate has expired. We give it back to you. We will not take the place of those whom the popular breath has just overthrown. Footnote. This was in the Journal Officiel de la République Française. End quote. They allowed the members of the government to withdraw quietly to Versailles, even such as they had in their hands like Ferry. In other words, they released the people that they had captured, the traitors. The communal elections convoked for the 22nd of March, but not necessarily traitors, right? Just members of the government that they had captured in their own effective coup d'etat because the government had ceased having popular support. The communal elections convoked for the 22nd of March through the demonstration of the Party of Order removed, footnote, to the 26th of March, was postponed. Gotcha. 21st March, the Assembly's frantic roars of dissent against the words Viva la République at the end of a proclamation, quote, to citizens and army soldiers. Tears. Quote, it might be a very legitimate proposal, etc. Dissent to the rolls. Jules Favre made harangue against the doctrine of the Republic being superior to universal suffrage, flattered the rural majority, threatened the Parisians with Prussian intervention, and provoked a demonstration of the Party of Order. Tears. Quote, come what may, he would not send an armed force to attack Paris. He had no troops yet to do it, of course. And then we got a bunch of French. Here's the English translation. The Central Committee was so little sure of its own victory that it hastily accepted the mediation by the mayors and deputies of Paris. Thiers' obstinacy permitted the committee to subsist 1 or 2 days. It then became aware of its own strength. Countless mistakes by the revolutionaries by the revolutionaries. Instead of disarming the police, they opened the gates to them. The police went to Versailles, where they were welcomed as saviors. They let the 43rd Regiment of the line leave. They sent home all the soldiers who had fraternized with the people. They allowed the reactionaries to organize themselves in the very center of Paris. They left Versailles undisturbed. Trident, Jacquard, Varlin, and Valent wanted to drive out the royalists immediately. Favre and Thiers took immediate action to obtain the support of the Prussian authorities in order to suppress the insurrectional movement in Paris. Trochu and Clement Thomas were constantly preoccupied with thwarting every attempt of the National Guard to arm and organize. The march on Versailles was decided on, prepared and undertaken by the Central Committee without the knowledge of the Commune and even in opposition to its expressed wish. Bergeret, instead of blowing up the bridge at Neuilly, which the communards could not protect on account of Mont-Valérien and the battery set of Courbevoie, he let the royalists seize it and strongly entrenched themselves there, thus assuring themselves a line of communication with Paris. So, honestly, I wish this section was up at the top. Then we could actually get, because this is essentially a timeline of events. As M. Littré said in a letter, Daily News, 20th of April, quote, Paris is armed, Paris manacled by the Vinoys, the Valentins, and the Paladins. The Republic was lost. This the Parisians understood. With the alternative of succumbing without fighting and risking terrible contests of uncertain issue, they chose to fight, and I cannot but praise them for it. End quote. The expedition to Rome, the work of Cavaignac, Jules Favre, and Thiers. Quote, a form of government that has all the internal advantages of a republican government and the external force of a monarchical government, I mean a federal republic, is a society made up of societies that constitute a new one, capable of growing by means of numerous associates, until its power is sufficient to ensure the security of those who have united. A republic of this kind may preserve its greatness without becoming internally corrupt. The form of the society prevents all disadvantages. This is Montesquieu, the liberal philosopher. This is interesting. I want to actually take a look at that. Okay. Constitution de 1793. The Constitution of the French Republic, adopted by a national convention of the revolutionary Jacobin dictatorship during the bourgeois French Revolution, it was more democratic than any other bourgeois constitutions of the 18th and 19th centuries. Okay, I don't think that we might read this. Statute 78, I think that's what this means. Let me just confirm. Section 78. Each commune of the Republic has a municipal administration. Each district an intermediate administration. Each department a central administration. Section 79. The municipal officials are elected by the assemblies of the commune. Section 80. The ministers are appointed by the electoral assemblies of the department and the district. Section 81. Half of the municipal and administration members are replaced every year. I think that this is the structure of the commune's electoral system and division of power. So let me just organize this. Okay, then Executive Council. Section 62, composed of 24 members. Section 63, the electoral assembly of each department nominates a candidate. The legislative body selects from the general list of members of this council. Section 64, in each legislature, the council replaces half of its members in the last month of its session. Section 65, the council is charged with the direction and supervision of the general administration. Section 66. It appoints, other than its own members, heads of general administration of the Republic. Section 68. These heads do not form a council. They are separated without direct connection between them. They do not exercise personal authority. Section 73. The council removes and replaces the officials it appoints. And we're going to do that again for our notes. Are you guys enjoying the legalese? Okay. Roused on the one hand by Jules Favre's call to civil war in the assembly, he told that the Prussians had threatened to interfere if the Parisians did not give in at once. Encouraged by the forbearance of the people and the passive attitude towards him of the Central Committee, the Party of Order at Paris resolved on a coup de main. That is the same, the way that Louis Bonaparte III came into position, which came off on the 22nd of March under the etiquette of a peaceful procession, peaceful demonstration against the revolutionary government. And it was a peaceful demonstration of a very peculiar character. Quote, the whole movement seemed a surprise. There were no preparations to meet it. A riotous mob of gentlemen, end quote. In their first rank, the familiars of the empire, the Hecarim, the Coteledon, the H. de Pen, etc., ill-treating and disarming National Guards detached from advanced sentries, who fled to the Place Vendôme, whence the National Guard marched at once to the Rue Neuve des Petits Champs. Meeting the rioters, they received order not to fire, but the rioters advanced under the cry, quote, down with the assassins, down with the committee. Insults to the guards, grasping at their muskets, shoot with a revolver Citizen Maljournal, lieutenant of the staff at the place, a member of the Central Committee. General Begret calls upon them to withdraw, to disband and retire. During about 5 minutes, the drums are beaten in the summonations, replacing the English reading of the Riot Act, made. They reply by cries of insult. 2 National Guards fall severely wounded. Meanwhile, their comrades hesitate and fire into the air. The rioters try to forcibly break through the lines and to disarm them. Begret commands fire, and the cowards fly. The riot is at once dispersed and the firing ceases. Shots are fired from houses on the National Guards. 2 of them, Wallin and François, are killed. 8 are wounded. The streets through which the Pacific disband are strewn with revolvers and sword canes, many of them picked up in the Rue de la Paix. The Comte de Montlinet, killed from behind by his own people, is found with a dagger fixed by a chain. Rappel was beaten. A number of cane swords, revolvers, and daggers lay on the street by which the, quote, unarmed demonstration had passed. Pistol shots are fired before the insurgents received orders to fire on the crowd. The manifestors were the aggressors, witnessed by General Sheridan from a window. This was simply an attempt to do by the reactionists of Paris, armed with revolvers, cane swords, and daggers, what Vinoy had failed to do with his sergeants de ville, soldiers, cannons, and mitraillettes. That the lowy orders, quote-unquote, of Paris allowed themselves not to be disarmed by the gentlemen of Paris was really too bad. These people don't believe that, anything bad can come of it. They, in the sense that they could have done all of this at any point and gone away with it under the previous administration. In this other administration, no, they can't get away with it. And then they cry foul. When on the 13th of June, 1849, the National Guards of Paris made a really unarmed and pacific procession to protest against the crime. The attack on Rome by the French troops, General Chagnier, was praised by his intimate tiers for sabering and shooting them down. Safe seizures declared, new laws of repression, new prescriptions, a new reign of terror. Instead of all that, the Central Committee and the workmen of Paris strictly kept on the defensive during the encounter itself, allowed the assailers, the gentlemen of the dagger, to return quietly home and by their indulgence, not calling them to account for this daring enterprise, encouraging them so much that 2 days later, under the leadership of Admiral Saisset, sent from Versailles, they rallied again and tried their hands at civil war. And this Vendôme affair evoked at Versailles the cry of assassination of unarmed citizens, reverberating throughout the world. Be it remarked that even Thiers, while eternally reiterating the assassination of the two generals, has not once dared to remind the world of this assassination of unarmed citizens. As in the medieval times, the knight may use any weapon whatever against a plebeian, but the latter must dare not even to defend himself. Quote, I give a formal contradiction to those who accuse me of leading the way for a monarchical settlement. I found a republic an accomplished fact. Before God and man, I declare I will not betray it. That was Thiers in 27 March, Versailles. End quote. After the second rise in the Party of Order, the Paris people took no reprisal whatever. The Central Committee even committed the great blunder against the advice of its most energetic members not to march at once at Versailles, where after the flight of Admiral Saisset and the ridiculous collapse of the National Guard of Order, consternation ruled supreme, there being not yet any forces of resistance organized. After the election of the Commune, the Party of Order tried again their forces at the ballot box, and, when again beaten, effected their exodus from Paris. During the election, handshaking and fraternization of the bourgeoisie in the courts of the mayoralists with the insurgent National Guards, while among themselves they talk at nothing but decimation in mass, mitraillette, frying cayenne, wholesale fusillades. Quote, the runaways of yesterdays think today, by flattering the men of the Hotel de Ville to keep them quiet until the rurals and Bonapartist generals who are gathering at Versailles will be in a position to fire on them. End quote. Thiers commenced the armed attack on the National Guard for the second time in the affair of April 2nd. Fighting between Corberet and Neuilly, close to Paris. National Guards beaten, Bridge Neuilly occupied by Thiers soldiers. Several thousands of National Guards having come out of Paris and occupied Corberet at Poitiers at the Bridge of Neuilly routed. Many prisoners taken. Many of the insurgents shot immediately as rebels. Versailles troops began the firing. Commune. Quote, the government of Versailles has attacked us. Not being able to count upon the army, it has sent pontifical Zouvets of the Charette, Bretons of Chauchu, and gendarmes of Valentin in order to bomb Neuilly. Quoted from the proclamation to the Paris National Guards, issued by the Executive Committee of the Commune on April 2nd, 1871, and published in the journal Officiel de la République Française, and also in the form of a governmental ordinance. On the 2nd April, the Versailles government had sent for the division chiefly consisting of gendarmes, marines, forest guard, and police. Vinoy with 2 brigades of infantry, and Galifet at the head of a brigade of cavalry and a battery of artillery advanced upon Courbevoie. Paris, April 4th. Military Declaration. Quote, the people of Paris were not making any aggressive attempt. When the government ordered it to be attacked by the ex-soldiers of the empire, organized as Praetorian troops under command of ex-senators. Le Revenger. And that is the text. Betrayal and poor choices and so on and so forth. Lenin speaks more about it in the State and Revolution because there's more afterwards that comes to the fore. But it was a very treacherous and very sad thing. The streets ran with what were accounted as literal rivers of blood. As they marched upon their own city and slaughtered en masse. But yeah, there's This is a very interesting piece, and I wanted to thank everybody who stuck around for the whole of it. Next time, we will be hitting up on, give me a second here, chapter 5 of the Civil War in France, that is to say, the third address, May 1871, the Paris Commune. And we should get through this one pretty quick. And then finally, we will read Engels's Postscript to this piece. We've read the first draft. Now we're going to read the section that really hits the home, that we had taken all those different quotes from, moving from the notes to the real text that emerged out of the notes. So we'll be able to essentially counterbalance it too. And then we'll go through the postscript. This will be done in a day, nice and easy. After that, we will make the decision whether or not we want to, because we're going to get into either party formation and all that sort of stuff. So how to organize the party in order to achieve the dictatorship of the proletariat. Because we kind of worked backwards. We started with the communist mode of production, then we went to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then we could go into the conditions which will lead to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And then from there we could also talk about capitalism, according to Marx. It should be interesting. We kind of go backwards. Alternatively, we could talk about writers after Marx and Engels on the two topics that we have gone over, which would be the communist mode of production and the dictatorship of the proletariat. I have been doing work going into our quotations that we have excerpted out, and in summarizing them, pulling out the key features and so on and so forth. The communist mode of production. After I'm done, I'll put them all together, and I will do some sort of presentation on it in this similar vein. We'll see if we can take anything out of that, but I want to know. We'll run a vote on it, on what we want to do next. But we're finally nearly done with this small part of it, and we're finally done with fucking notes. We're not gonna read any more notes for a long time. Isn't that amazing? And no more fucking French. Just English. Just wonderful, beautiful English. Thank you so much. What a glorious day. Okay. I'm going to end the recording now. Thank you everybody who is listening here. And I will see you next time.